To our Monticello live stream. I'm Melanie Boyer, and I'm joined today by Bill Barker, portraying Thomas Jefferson. Today, we'll be discussing Jefferson's military connections. In the comment section, let us know where you're joining from, and please leave any questions that you have for Mr. Jefferson. So to start off, Mr. Jefferson, our nation by law now sets aside a day to commemorate the memories of our valiant soldiers who have fallen in combat, as well as a day to recognize our nation's branches of armed service, including both those in service at the present and the veterans of our armed forces. Have you known of a similar day of commemoration in our nation's history?
Well, what a coincidental question, and I thank you all for gathering once again here at Al Monticello. I say coincidental because I was just reflecting upon my own commission in the military. This, if you will, was my colonel's hat. Oh, yes. Many people do not realize that I myself was a lieutenant, county lieutenant of militia here in the former colony of Virginia, also referred to often as colonel of militia. And this is my hat, and still with the particular cockade that recognized myself as colonel during our American Revolutionary War. Now, as I said, that might be rather startling to some of you because not many regard me holding any military rank. But many may also know that my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, held the very same commission. He was county lieutenant of Albemarle County. And my grandfather, Colonel Thomas Jefferson the Younger, was county lieutenant of Henrico County, where he resided just south of Richmond. And so if I have known those of holding military rank, not only during the American Revolution, I certainly was born into it, knowing many of military rank. Good heavens, many of my father's neighbors and friends in this vicinage were Colonel Dr. Thomas Walker, Colonel George Harvey, Colonel Joshua Fry, and of course, one who came by frequently to survey as a young major of Virginia militia became Colonel George Washington. Many have wondered just exactly what does the commission of colonel imply. And so I have here with me the particular commission. It may be interesting to you all to hear this. I say so because this was a very, very responsible position. I quote, June 9th, 1770. I was a mere 27 years old. His Excellency, the Right Honorable Norburne Baron de Botetourt, His Majesty's Lieutenant and Governor General of the Colony and Dominion of Virginia and Vice Admiral of the same, to Thomas Jefferson, Esquire. That is correct. I was still practicing law at that time. Great Britain had not closed down the courts of justice. Further, by virtue of the power and authority to me given as His Majesty's Lieutenant and Governor General of this his colony and dominion, I, reposing special trust and confidence in your loyalty, courage, and conduct, do hereby constitute and appoint you, the said Thomas Jefferson, to be Lieutenant of the County of Albemarle and Chief Commander of all His Majesty's militia, horse and foot, in the said County of Albemarle. And I do give unto you full power and authority to command, levy, arm, and muster all persons which are or shall be liable to be levied and listed in the same county. You are therefore carefully and diligently to discharge the duty of Lieutenant and Chief Commander of the militia. Well, citizens, I think that is one to state it all, that it is an honor to be commissioned a lieutenant of county militia, to realize that the commission comes from the government itself. A militia is not legal any other way. And so it is as we began to form our Army of these States United. We brought together many of those former militias formed when we were a colony of Virginia to help create the army of these states united. And that occurred through all of the adjoining states in our new nation. So I hope we never forget when we are discussing, if you will, the authority of military service, that authority is in the service of our government, of our nation. As I have written and many others, the only purpose of any government and its laws is to protect people from injury by one and the other. That protection is so necessary, and we all actually swore an oath to that when we voted on behalf of our Declaration of American Independence. That was our letter to the rest of the world, informing them of what we had done to create a new world order vested in the inalienable right of self-government. That's why I've always thought that the very last line is the most important. I quote that. In support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I think this needs repeating, as I said earlier, to refresh our knowledge of what it takes to be an American citizen in support of our government and its effort to protect us. That is why we always should give thanks to our nation's veterans, and more importantly, to those who served our nation and gave their last full measure, their lives, for our safety and protection. It seems appropriate this time of year, particularly as roses are beginning to bloom, as we visit, if you will, the graves of those we lost in our nation's war. It was always a habit and a custom to memorialize, if you will, not only their lives, but their service with rose bushes planted at their graves. I perhaps have meandered too long enough upon these reflections. I do beg your pardon. And other questions that you may have?
Well, you touched on this a little bit, mentioning your family members who had served in the military, but did they actually serve during a period of war and times of peace? And any other members of your immediate family you'd like to talk about?
Well, I'm sorry to say that though I held the commission of Lieutenant of County Militia, that is Colonel of Virginia Militia, no, I never saw any battle. I never saw any action. Of course, I was elected the second governor of our new Commonwealth during the time of our American Revolution. And I gave up my commission as colonel in 1779 when I retired as governor of our Commonwealth, or at least was elected governor to continue to serve and finally retired. Lamentably, my father never saw any action or saw any battle, even though he was colonel of Virginia Militia. And he died right at the beginning of what we refer to as the French and Indian War. His good friend, I referred to him earlier, Colonel Joshua Fry, did actually lead an expedition on the way to Fort Duquesne as the French and Indian War began here in our former colonies. He did not see any military action simply because he was thrown from his horse on that expedition northwards and died within 3 days. A young Virginia major who was under his service on that expedition then assumed the rank of colonel. That was Major George Washington, who then became Colonel George Washington. I think we must also remember that during the war, the American Revolution, it was not only the men who were out serving in the fields. It was not only the men who had either enlisted in our service or had already been commissioned, if they were the eldest son of a freeholder's family with military rank. It was also the ladies. I think you're well familiar with a letter that Mr. John Adams allowed me to read when we were both together in Philadelphia, sitting on the committee to write our nation's Declaration of American Independence. That was a letter from his wife, Abigail Adams, in which he said, "Remember the ladies." Well, citizens, it may be known by some of you, but generally I understand it is not known, that my own wife, the late Mrs. Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, also served in a capacity to encourage the womenfolk, the wives of our Virginia families, to raise funds, to provide even jewelry to be sold for the support of our armies. In fact, I am told that amongst my late wife's letters, the majority of which, it is generally known, I have taken the liberty to destroy. I consider that only the business between my late wife and myself, and no one else's, particularly as I have become so scrutinized on the stage of world concerns and in the future. I do not want those I've held so deeply in my heart to be so scrutinized as well. But my point is, there is one letter that I am told still survives of my late wife. It was discovered amongst the letters of the late Mrs. George Washington, and I happen to have it right here as well. This is what my late wife wrote to one Mrs. Eleanor Conway Madison. Yes, as her name is wont to suggest, she was related to my dear friend, Mr. James Madison, up there at Montpelier. This was written by my late wife in Richmond, August the 8th, 1780, to wit, Madam, Mrs. Washington has done me the honor of communicating the enclosed proposition of our sisters in Pennsylvania, and of informing me that the same grateful sentiments are displaying themselves in Maryland, justified by the sanction of her letter in handing forward the scheme I undertake with cheerfulness, than the duty of furnishing to my countrywomen an opportunity of proving that they also may participate of those virtuous feelings which have given birth to it. I cannot do more for its promotion than by enclosing to you some of the papers to be disposed of as you think proper. I am, with the greatest respect, madam, your most humble servant, Martha Jefferson. Do you know that many of the ladies in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, in Maryland, furnished for the support of our army during the Revolution some of their family jewelry, rings and necklaces? Some offer paper money in the hundreds and thousands of those early dollars, and still some more in English pounds. In fact, I know of several who gave for their service of our nation their gold wedding bands. So never let us forget the ladies. Your next question.
There's a question from Deborah, and she's interested in learning more about the evolution of your opinions on the United States having a standing army. Did that change over time?
Well, Deborah, I've always been concerned about that debate. It has been from, as far as I know, time immemorial in the founding of our nation, whether we ought to have a standing army during times of peace. Now, you may know that General Secretary Alexander Hamilton was very much in favor of that. He believed that a standing army needed to be supported by the government, whereas I retaliated and said, yes, but it'll be a great drain to our treasury, particularly during times of peace. And would not foreign nations wonder, what are we up to during times of peace if we are supporting a national army, a standing army? I have also said, has not nature supplied us with several thousand miles of ocean to the east of our coast as a barrier, a natural barrier against the ancient tumults and calumnies of European kingdoms? Well, it was the opinion of General Hamilton that a standing army would assure our peace, let alone our preparation in times of immediate warfare, that we must be prepared for war. And I certainly could not deny that. That would make sense. And yet I was very concerned of this close tie of a standing army in times of peace with whatever government is in power. And by that, Miss Deborah, I'm referring to the fact that General Hamilton had already created somewhat of a political platform known as the Federalist, with very close ties to our federal government. So what you are suggesting had indeed been an argument for quite some time, until, if you will, when I became president, I found it of necessity to create a military peace act. That's right, a military peace act. It almost seems incongruent or in support of what we have been talking about, having a standing army in times of peace. But this was meant to create, if you will, a military that would be well educated, well informed, and devoted to the pursuit of science with respect to engineering and fortifications and surveying and the like, particularly the strengthening of our coastlines, if you will. So what you're asking is a most valid question with regard to protecting our nations, not only in times of peace, but in times when we are called to war.
Okay, we have a question here about the Revolution. How confident were you in General Washington's troops during the Revolution? Did you think he would win the war, or were you unsure?
Well, I do not want to make it seem that as I had invited General Horatio Gates to come visit me here at Monticello. This was during my time as governor, and during that time, I corresponded with many of the generals and officers in our army, particularly to protect and defend our Commonwealth of Virginia. I do not want to assume that simply because I had invited General Gates to come visit here, and I'm not saying that he did not, that it would mean I supported him in what became known as the Conway Cabal. I think many of you understand that. He had something to do in that effort to unseat General Washington as our nation's commander during the war. But certainly there were many questions raised. There cannot help but be questions raised depending upon where we lived in our new states and commonwealths at the time, as to whether we were being the best protected and defended, as to whether the army would be right there, immediate, to any action that might be taken in our neighborhood or in our state or our commonwealth. So you cannot be engaged in war without questions of military leadership. Who is best? Who is not only the best prepared and experienced, but most knowledgeable with tactics and logistics and strategies? But of course, however, I will tell you this, having known General Washington from the days of my youth, he was a friend of my father's, regarded as a most accomplished surveyor as well, and a good friend, as I mentioned earlier, my father's friend, Colonel Joshua Fry. I remained in General Washington's support, and happily so. In fact, I was present when the general resigned his commission as general of our armies, that day in December 1783, when our Congress was in Annapolis. We all knew then, if we had never felt it before, he had served us like no one else could have possibly served us, maintaining our morale in general, always persevering, always moving forward. Yes, he had defeats. He himself recognized that, but he never gave up. And when he did give up his sword, we all realized that he is truly a Cincinnatus. A Cincinnatus, of course, that ancient Roman general who served Rome well in protection, safety, and defense. But then, after the wars were over, he gave up his sword for retirement under his own vine and fig. That is the mark of a true leader, particularly a leader we would want as our first president, who would know when to give up power to retire again at his home.
So shifting gears a little bit, can we talk about when you were president? Can you tell us a little bit about the U.S. declaring war with the Kingdom of Tripoli?
Oh my, that did fall on my desk, did it not? It fell on my desk, but it was something in its inception that had been with us for many, many years. And who to know better than myself, because when I was serving our nation as Minister Plenipotentiary at the court of King Louis of France, it was one of my duties to negotiate treaties of trade with not only the Kingdom of France, but with other European kingdoms. And nonetheless, with the Kingdom of Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco, In fact, I spent some time down in Marseille in the south of France, along the northern Mediterranean, in order to negotiate with many of the representatives of those aforementioned Barbary kingdoms. I knew well the Kamanali family. They had been a family ruling Tripoli for several generations. I believe they came into power in the early 18th century. And we all knew well that Youssef Kamarali and his brother Hamid Kamarali had been in constant contention with one and the other, and that if we formed treaties of trade with the one, might it be unsettled by the other. Well, the one thing was certain in time. We began to realize Youssef, having asserted his power and having cast his brother out of power in a coup, a military coup in Tripolitania, that Youssef would become the enemy of our young nation. The reason is simply because in the Mediterranean, any nation, any kingdom of Europe had long been accustomed to pay tribute monies to pirates who were supported and were able to be protected in the harbors of many of these European kingdoms in the Mediterranean. Tribute money was simply money that all of the nations would pay these pirates to go away. In its essence, it's no different than the Danegeld. I don't know whether you've heard of the Danegeld, but reading medieval history and the history of the ancient Vikings, you would learn of the Vikings extorting many of the British, Scottish, and Gaelic tribes that they would attack by sailing from the kingdoms of Norway and Denmark in what we know as Great Britain. And yet these peoples, the Picts, the Scots, the British tribes, would pay the Vikings gold to go away. Danegeld. Well, tribute was nonetheless. Our nation suffered from that, both before and after our American Revolution. Do you know that Tripoli in particular considered us to still be British? The British paid the highest tribute. They expected that from us. You might look upon it as a toll to be paid before you could sail peacefully into the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, right there at the Straits of Gibraltar. If you did not pay this Danegeld, if you did not pay this tribute, well, imagine. The pirates would attack. They would overwhelm your ship. They would take it as a prize. A prize, of course, is a ship captured by an enemy, brought into an enemy port, and then all of the goods would be sold from that ship. And perhaps the sailors impressed into the service of that enemy nation or created slaves within that enemy nation. We suffered this to the point where President John Adams, President Washington before him, even myself, suggested that we need a navy, a national navy, in order to protect us at sea, particularly to protect our trade. And thankfully, yes, in John Adams' administration, we saw 6 frigates be built to protect our trade at sea. It was not enough. And therefore, when I became president, as you asked initially in your question, they felt, that is, Kamarali Youssef of Tripoli, that President Jefferson now is the new president of the United States, that we will impress upon his nation, with his new administration, a Danegeld, a tribute heretofore unknown in its extent. They asked for over $225,000 as tribute. Some may say, perhaps some Federalist, it's a small amount to pay for the conduct of business. But it may be a small amount to pay for those who can afford it. It is an extravagant amount for our nation or any nation to have to pay, and I was opposed to it. I denied it. And with that, getting back to Youssef Kamarali, well, he thought it was time to show the rest of the Mediterranean, let alone the world, that they were not going to accept that answer from our new nation or from President Jefferson. They tore down the flag from our embassy in Tripoli City and declared war on us. And so there we were. In a war, quite different from our own American Revolution. In a war, quite different from that undeclared war, if you will, in the late 1790s, or our conflict that we had with France there. We only lost a very few soldiers or seamen and had some destruction at sea, yes, but this was a war that had to be formally entered into. So you ask me, how did I attend to it? At the desk of the Chief Magistrate of our nation? Well, I am certainly familiar with our Constitution. Our Constitution states distinctly that for our nation to go to war, it needs the consent of Congress. Congress has to vote on this. And that is what I hope for. And yet Congress would not accept it as their duty. In fact, they suggested that they would give me their support to declare it myself. And you might say that as commander-in-chief in our nation, that I would have the authority. And yes, when an immediate moment is want to help us rise up and provoke us that we must do something, well then yes, I declared war on Tripoli. And so we set out on the seas as best we could. I set out in order to commission several of our Marines. This is the first time in our history where our nation commissioned our own soldiers to fight on foreign soil. And though it took us more than 4 years, nearly 5, let us not forget that we were indeed victorious. Victorious with the exploits of Captain Stephen Decatur, who, though our frigate, the Philadelphia, was captured by Tripoli, our sailors then incarcerated into the service of Tripoli, many of them made slaves. Captain Decatur in the Intrepid, his little ketch, no different than a piratical corsair. Corsairs were, of course, those sleek bow piratical ketches, little boats in which they conducted their extortions. Well, Captain Decatur, our captain, sailed into the harbor of Tripoli at night, very stealthily. They boarded the Philadelphia. They released many of our sailors who had been incarcerated on board, and then they set our own frigate, the Philadelphia, afire, so that the enemy would never be able to have use of it. You know, I understand that when Admiral Nelson, Horatio Nelson, quite an extraordinary commander in himself, heard of this exploit, he remarked, how bold indeed was this particular action. I think it must have struck him that our young nation could engage itself so stealthily, almost, if you will, in the kind of warfare that we had been accustomed to here in North America, let alone at sea. That which had been practiced by the natives for many, many centuries. A kind of, I heard someone comment the other day, a guerrilla warfare, where you seek every opportunity to deny the advance of an enemy and do not allow them so formally to think they may have an advantage. It is bold and perhaps distinctly American.
So in the midst of our nation's war with Tripoli, you also found time as president to ensure the education of future military officers and prepare our nation for future conflicts. How did that project come about?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I'm happy to receive some credit for it, but rather, I would like the credit to be given to General Washington. I would like the credit to be given to General Knox, Henry Knox. And yes, I'll even suggest we give some credit to General Alexander Hamilton. This had been a question discussed for many, many years. In fact, as we declared our independence in 1776, I believe it was General Washington, let alone supported with General Knox, to suggest we needed a proper military academy for the instruction of our officers, if only in strengthening themselves as a military force. Proper dynamics, if you will, of training. And remember, too, we had to look to European generals and invite European officers to come and train our troops. I cannot help but think of anyone the more successful than von Steuben, General von Steuben, who came to our aid and properly trained our troops, magnanimous during that winter at Valley Falls. And so this is something we realized had already been created, military academies created, particularly in France, l'École militaire in the 1740s, of the military academy in Great Britain at about the same time, 1750s. And they tell me now it is known as Sandhurst. All of this, and remember too, lest I forget, do you know during my first year as Minister Plenipotentiary at the court of Louis XVI in France, I could have very well passed a young cadet on the streets of Paris who was in the l'École militaire, beginning his military career. I'm referring to Cadet Napoleon Bonaparte. So this was something that we realized we need to begin for ourselves. After our victory, and after certain exploits, not to our great favor, at Fort West Point along the Hudson, I say not to our favor, I think you're well acquainted with the exploits of General Benedict Arnold during the time when General Washington was overseeing the defenses at West Point. But thank heaven, we were able to ameliorate that, General Kosciuszko taking charge, and then to realize if there were to be any location that would provide an immediate protection for the Hudson River, because that was our concern at the beginning of the American Revolution, the enemy would go straight to the northern states, cut off all of New England along the Hudson River from the rest of our nation, that this would be an appropriate location as well for a military academy. And so I mentioned the Military Peace Act. When I became president, that was voted by Congress in 1802 to create a military that would be devoted to more Republican sentiments in our nation's governing, not so Federalist as I and many others had worried our military had become connected. So this meant that it would be more of a military in service of the people, if you will, through their government, that the military would not render itself superior to the government or superior to the people. And to ensure that, there ought to be a proper military academy to teach, if you will, not only Republican principles, not only the principles of self-government, particularly unto the officers, that they might understand true patriotism is the love and protection of our country, not to be swayed by political opinion, and also devoted to the pursuit of science. I referred back earlier to the necessity of surveying, as the British call it, corps of sappers and miners that follow through in a survey to dig roads, provide fortifications, if you will, even barracks. All of that needs to be properly and formally instructed. And so it was that I had the great pleasure through that Military Peace Act, 1802, as president to commission our military academy. There in March 1802. So I'm proud to receive some recognition in that accomplishment.
Well, did you play any part in creating the educational curriculum at West Point or appointing the first commandant and teachers?
Well, I played somewhat of a small part, but I would not want to deny the part that was played by none other than my good friend, to whom I was introduced by Dr. Benjamin Franklin while I was in Paris, when I first arrived in Paris, Monsieur Pierre Samuel Dupont. Monsieur Dupont and I became fast friends during the 5 years I was in France. And as you well know, later, as we settled our government in Philadelphia, Monsieur Dupont and his two sons sailed to our nation to take up their own residence. Well, Monsieur Dupont and I had already been corresponding one with the other about the necessity of a universal system of education, universal throughout our entire nation, to be attended to by the poor as well as the wealthy, the female as well as the male. Well, no sooner did Monsieur Dupont arrive than he helped our nation in two particular efforts. First and foremost, the idea of a military academy. Yes, he was so interested. And when you're talking about having any influence in creating the curriculum, first and foremost, a school of engineering. Again, a school of engineering no less necessary than surveying to build fortifications, to build the preparation of our nation if we are called to war. Courses in mathematics, in the highest levels of mathematics, meaning trigonometry in its perfection, let alone geometry and everything else so necessary. History, the history of ancient warfare, of the ancient Greek states, of ancient Rome, the conflicts of the medieval ages with the Gauls and the Teutons and the Visigoths, all of that to be reflected upon. Learning, if you will, the principles of battle and warfare and how to be prepared in those instances. But even though the curriculum would be devoted to science and to mathematics and to strategies, it would also be devoted to learning large language, English preparations, if you will, natural philosophy, moral philosophy. All of that is part of forming the complete gentleman, let alone forming the complete officer who is best equipped to lead his corps, his soldiers into battle for the defense and protection of our nation. So I thank Monsieur Pierre Samuel Dupont for being of such service in that regard, in helping to create our curriculum at our military academy at West Point, and nonetheless to thank him for the service he provided our nation in helping to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and Louisiana. For indeed, he was of the very first and continuous influence in that so-called Louisiana purchase.
We have time for one more question. What advice may you share with us as to how and why we should honorably recognize our nation's military heroes?
My advice is that we remind ourselves in the government of, by, and for the people, that those who enter the military service of our nation have already taken the oath to give their lives, if necessary, for our protection and defense. That means each and every one of us to be well prepared as well, that we will be called upon, if you will, in times of war, let alone perhaps with the idea that we could go to war, that we ourselves will be prepared mentally, be prepared to continue to hold ourselves tightly together, e pluribus unum. When I think of all of us, I think nonetheless of a member of the Hemings family here at our Monticello. It was during the time of war. It was during the time that I was governor. It was actually on the day that I have been looking forward to, Monday, June the 4th, 1781, when I would finally leave the office of governor, hand the gavel to General Nelson, Thomas Nelson. It was right here at Monticello. And we learned that very morning that Monticello would be besieged by British dragoons. Oh, it's a very well-known story, the midnight ride of Jack Jewett. But I hope it is equally renowned that as we were preparing my family to take leave, to go down the poplar forest where they might be protected and defended, and where it is said that I took my time to make certain that our family plate and our silver and the papers of state would be secured and buried beneath the floorboards. Two individuals, Caesar but Martin Hemings, helped us to secure that property of our Monticello. And furthermore, that when the enemy finally did arrive, and I had long since taken leave, that the captain of those British dragoons, one Captain McLeod, approached Martin Hemings, demanding to know where Governor Jefferson was. Was he still within the house? Was he hiding? Had he escaped? Where was he? Martin Hemings refused to answer. And so it is, all eyewitnesses assert that Captain McLeod took out his pistol and pointed it directly to the chest of Martin Hemings and said, "I demand to know where your master is, or I will inflict a deadly wound." And the eyewitness account, to a person, Martin opened his coat and said, "Fire away." Let us not forget all of us. Let us not forget our families, nonetheless American, and what we are working for on behalf of every American, our safety and defense. And with all this, a blessing to those who have served our nation and will continue to serve our nation, that they may be called upon to give their highest effort. I thank you for the opportunity we could gather together at this time. I hope that I have spurred reflections and memories, indeed the more so to think more about what it takes in recognizing freedom is not free. It requires an eternal vigilance. I remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed until we meet again.